Yo, Shortbox Nation, this is Botter, and I'm here to tell you right now that con season starts early this year with the return of Northeast Florida's premier anime, comic book, and sci-fi event, Collective Con. That's right, Northeast Florida's largest pop culture convention returns for its 10th year on March 8th through the 10th at the Prime Osborne Center in Jacksonville, Florida. 10 years of Collective Con, they're pulling all the stops out to make sure this is a can't-miss event. And the guest list they got going, don't even get me started on the guest list. I mean, they've got A-list celebrity guests and voice actors from some of your favorite movies, anime, and video games like Elijah Wood and Sean Ashton, Ray Park, Trisha Helfer, Ross Marquand, Max Middleman, and Bo-Katan herself will be there, Katie Sackhoff. Tell me what other convention is giving you the opportunity to meet Frodo and Sam from Lord of the Rings, Darth Maul, and One Punch Man all under the same roof. Only at Collective Con. And if you're looking to get some of your favorite comics signed, or if you want to get an original sketch from some of the best comic artists in the world, well, you're in luck, because there'll be plenty of comic and creator guests there, like DC comic artist extraordinaire Clay Mann, Harvey Award-nominated illustrator John Taylor Christopher, Marvel and DC cover artist Chris Stevens, and acclaimed Star Wars author Timothy Zahn. They'll all be at Collective Con this year. And if you're looking to bring the family, or if you want to make a weekend out of it, you're in luck, because there'll be so much going on at Collective Con that weekend in the form of vendors, fan panels, video game tournaments, cosplay contests, after parties, and a bunch of fan events. You can purchase single and 3-day weekend passes now using the link in this episode's show notes, or by going to collectivecon.com to book your tickets and hotel. Buy your tickets now, and I'll see you at Collective Con, March 8th through the 10th. Now let's start the show.
And then there's the other part of my brain that's like, fuck it, let's do a YA comic. Even though the last thing you did is full of mayhem, nudity, and bloodshed, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do, right?
Ladies and gents, fanboys and fangirls, I present to you the Shortbox Podcast. Yo, Shortbox Nation, and new friends tuning in for the first time, welcome to our Season 7 debut. I am your host, Botter. You are now tuned into the Shortbox Podcast, your soon-to-be new favorite comic book podcast. We like to focus on comic reviews, artist spotlights, recommendations, and interviews with the best creators in the industry, including the distinguished guest we have with us today. I'm joined by my right-hand man, Cesar Cordero, my co-host for this episode. You'll hear from him and our guest very soon. I just have to share some things that paid the bills, so no hard feelings if you want to fast forward to this part. This episode is brought to you by our sponsor, Gotham City Limit, Jacksonville, Florida's premier location for comics, collectibles, toys, and more. Check them out if you live in the area or ever find yourself in Jacksonville looking for a really awesome comic shop. If you aren't already subscribed to this podcast, go ahead and do that right now. You've already made it this far. Why not stay up to date with our future interviews and episodes? We've got some impressive guests and topics lined up for the rest of the season, if I do say so myself. And last but not least, we want to thank our Shortbox patrons for their contributions. Their support helps us grow the show and produce episodes like the one you're about to enjoy. Consider becoming a patron yourself and support the podcast. You'll get dozens of bonus episodes, merch, and more. Find out more by visiting patreon.com/theshortbox. With that out the way, let's move on to our main event. As I mentioned earlier, this is the first episode of our new season, and what better way to bring in this ceremonious occasion than with a guest who is no stranger to writing some of the most popular comics in the industry today, including co-creating the action comic The Strange Tales of Luther Strode and writing other popular comics for Image like Reaver and Dead Body Road. He's also penned issues of DC's Green Lantern, The New Lanterns, and Marvel's Monsters Unleashed, and that's just naming a small few. He's left his mark with most comic publishers you can think of, but he's here with us today to talk about a creator-owned body of work, Urban Animal, a webtoon series which is now seeing a print release for the first time thanks to a dedicated Kickstarter that just launched at the time of this recording, which, might I add, is performing remarkably well. Shortbox Nation, we're privileged to welcome Justin Jordan to the show. Hey Justin, how are you?
Hi guys, thanks for having me. Much appreciated.
Yeah, no.
Pleasure to have you on, my man.
Our pleasure. Little peons like us getting a chat with the big dogs.
Yeah, it's funny whenever you say left his mark on the industry. I'm like, I think of it as more of a stain, but you know.
People love that stain, though. I'm telling you, you got some big fans. Can I go ahead and give Amber, or Topa Black, as some may know her, a big shout out and virtual hug for making this episode happen? Yeah. She connected us on Facebook, and Justin, honestly, for as long as I've known her, she's recommended your comics, whether that was at the comic shop or when she was a host on this show back in the day. I vividly remember her suggesting I add Luther Strode to my pull box. Hell, sometimes
She suggested Reaver to me, man.
sometimes she would throw comics in my pull box, no questions asked. I would just find them and she'd be like, read it. Like she did with the first issue of Reaver. She always treated your comics like it was Fight Club. She'd be like, you reading Luther Strode? What you know about, Justin Jordan?
I really appreciate that. I love her. She's great. I'm bummed that I didn't get to see her this year. Often, many years, I would get to see her at Heroes. And of course, there was no Heroes convention this year or any other convention.
Yeah,
so I miss her.
Do you have that kind of relationship or admiration of other comic shop owners? And if so, what do you personally attribute to that level of loyalty?
I do. I have a few others that have worked out that way. And I think a lot of it is, I don't know, I've been really lucky and there's been people who dig my comics and, I try to, basically not be a dick, and treat people that like my stuff as well as I possibly can. And I think that has kind of led to it. It's been interesting. There are comic shops. I can think of a few of them that really turn into like a hub for my stuff. Like they recommend it to the people that come in and they end up selling quite a lot of my comics. It's funny because you can look at 25% of my sales came from like five different comic shops or whatever, you know what I mean? Which is kind of fascinating. So it's great. It's one of those things that I've been really lucky to have had in my career and I really appreciate it. In Amber's case, she rolled up to my table and was talking about Luther Strode, and I gave her a free T-shirt, and I have given her I have let her use my table as sanctuary away from the con. So I think she likes me personally in addition to the work. So that works out well for me because I like her. So it's gone well.
Man, I could hear like the genuine surprise in your voice when it comes to all this stuff. Like, man, it's like these comic book stores end up being a hub for my work and whatnot. But I got to tell you, and let me get this off my chest. Let me gush a little bit here. A lot of people get busy and they feel like they don't have time to really like slow down and really enjoy something that they used to maybe as kids, right? I think the best praise I can give you and your work is that it has successfully made me feel like I can slow down time for a good story. And I'm not just saying that. Like, I'm a hard sell when it comes to comics. And every time I've had somebody suggest, whether it was Luther Strode or Reaver, I've never felt like, all right, I got to make time for this. Like, it's like, oh man, this is okay. I'm in for it. I'm like, I'm locked in.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate that. It's interesting. I've, unsurprisingly, since we've got the Kickstarter going, I've been doing a lot of interviews just in the last week or two, compared to the usual.
I was gonna say you're talking to a guy who backed your Kickstarter, so I'm
much
happy.
Appreciated. But I got asked the other day, like, what do you want in comics, right? Like out of my creative output, and honestly, for me. It's not that I don't have, artistic ambitions in the sense of like thematic stuff or, social stuff that I want to comment on. Because I do. But I think of myself in some senses as sort of fundamentally a pulp writer. And by what I mean by that is that my first goal always is to entertain the people that are reading my stuff and to entertain myself, and I try to think about what I like in comics and what I think is cool and what excites me when I read comics and then produce my version of that. So it is always really heartening to me when people actually are really enjoying my stuff and really, become fans of it and hearing that, that aspect of kind of slowing down time and, kind of bringing you back to the joy of comics and stuff is, probably the best sort of compliment I could be given.
And speaking of fans of your work, we're hoping to convert a few of our listeners that haven't seen the light that is Justin Jordan Comics. Even for those that are familiar with your work and are just hearing about Urban Animal for the first time, will you please tell us what it's about?
Sure. Urban Animal is the comic series that I do over at Webtoon. So it is a digital comic first. It's a web series. We update weekly when the season is on. We're currently up to season 3 right now. So there are currently 72 episodes of it. And it is about Joe Gomez, who was a fairly ordinary high school kid. He had, his parents were reasonably cool. His friends were pretty great. He thought his band was doing okay. And, it seems like the new girl's probably into him. And then he turns into a saber-toothed tiger and it all goes to shit. As they do.
As they do, right. Absolutely.
As they do. Because it turns out that Joe is actually a chimera, which in the urban animal universe is a kind of nature spirit that is supposed to be a guardian of nature. But, it also makes you a target of things like soul parasites and devourers and, the great big bad Ralabast, who is maybe coming back to life in a sort of Harry Potter Voldemort way. And, Joe is the only person who can stop it. It is hard to go further than that because a lot of what I think actually makes the comic really cool is incredibly spoilery. But I will say that if you like things like Buffy the Vampire Slayer or even kind of old school Spider-Man, even though we don't have costumes and stuff, I think Urban Animal is something that you would really enjoy. It is one of my favorite things that I have actually done. It ranks in the top 2 or 3 of projects that I've done that I really think are really entertaining and also me working at, sort of the tops of my ability. So I'm very proud of it.
You should be, man, because I read some of that stuff and I'm a huge fan of all things horror, whether it's movies, books, novels, comics, music as well. But even if you're not, even if like on a pop culture level, if you're maybe like, I'm 39 years old. So as soon as I read the very first few panels of Urban Animal, I immediately thought of Bram Stoker's Dracula based on the imagery. And I was like,
oh yeah,
I wonder if this is like being pulled from. And then later on, I see a poster of, that same movie in Joe's room.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, my heart swoon. It's like this kid was, I'm telling you, Justin, look wise, interest wise, and even instrument wise, Joe Gomez was me in high school. It's frightening.
Oh, sweet.
It's so frightening. But it's good in the best way possible. And again, not to toot your horn too much, but as far as like the idea that he's a chimera, I think that's kind of neat because every time I think of your work, you're kind of a shapeshifter in, not in the John Carpenter The Thing sense, but I guess in a writing sense, because I can look at a book like Reaver or Luther Strode or Urban Animal, and I don't see like, this guy's a one-trick pony. It's like, no, you get different stories every time, and it's cool.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you appreciate it because I describe it as having a near terminal ability to stay in my lane. There's a part of my brain that's like the business part, and it says, yeah, you should stay on brand and you should, do things that are within this niche and try to build out an audience that way and all that stuff. And then there's the other part of my brain that's like, fuck it, let's do a YA comic. Even though the last thing you did is full of mayhem, nudity, and bloodshed, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do, right? And that latter voice gets listened to more often than not. So I have ended up doing a bunch of kind of disparate things, which I think it's probably worked to my benefit. I think it has given me, I think it is part of the reason I've had career longevity. It's also sort of fascinating. This is slightly a tangent. It is fascinating to me that a lot of my work for hire is I get hired on to do stuff that I would not, if I were doing the hiring, I wouldn't be the guy that would be first in mind to do it. So it's been sort of fascinating to me. Like, when I do at DC Comics, like with, for instance, Green Lantern, New Guardians, which was a run that I really enjoyed doing and I thought turned out well. But back then, if you had said, hey, what DC books do you think Justin Jordan should be doing? It would have been something like Lobo, which I try to get DC to let me do literally every quarter, which I haven't broken them yet, but I still keep trying.
I think it's safe to say it's definitely piqued the interest of quite a few people talking about Urban Animal. I understand it's got over 465,000 subscribers. Woo! And like you mentioned, it's 3 seasons deep. In your words, how has the overall reception been from your peers or fans? And And did you face any obstacles, or maybe even, some haterade, some haters out there for going the digital route? Yo, this is Botter. Sorry for interrupting this episode, but I'll keep it brief. I wanted to let you know about a massive sale we have going on over at the Shortbox store on all of our merchandise and apparel. That's theshortboxstore.bigcartel.com. You can now save 20% off your entire order using the discount code YOO, Y-O-O. So if you've been waiting for the right time to finally buy that gauntlet snapback, or if you ever wanted to buy any of the shirts you see me wear on the podcast, well, now's your chance to get them for a steal. We still have a few sizes left of everything, but they won't last long, and once they're gone, they are gone. And then I mentioned that all of our apparel is screen printed on high quality material. None of that heat transfer or direct to garment stuff. Our shirts are some of the most comfortable ones you'll ever wear, and the hats look even better in person. So wear your support for the Shortbox Nation proudly, knowing that you're going to look damn good doing it. Get to theshortboxstore.bigcartel.com as soon as you can, and don't forget to use that discount code YOO, Y-O-O, to save 20% off your entire order. All of this information can be found in this episode's show notes if you want to get there faster. Thanks for not pressing fast forward. Now back to the show.
I don't. And honestly, aside from any other aspect that might have led to that, part of that is because the people in the direct market, print market that I work in, by and large, don't know that Urban Animal exists, and vice versa. I would say, out of that 475, it is 475 now. So we've actually added some since I wrote that press release. That is not to brag. I am just internally amused by the growth and how fast it goes, especially when you're used to comic books, where if you're cracking 10K on an image book for singles, you're actually doing pretty great.
Yeah.
So to add 10,000 readers in a week or two is kind of insane to me still. But those are almost entirely separate markets. And so it is kind of like having a secret identity in that there is very little crossover between them. So there's been very little reaction, which, to soapbox a little bit, is, I think, to the detriment of direct market comics. One thing that I've pointed out a few times is that within the U.S. market, I know when I talk about comics, and I'm betting this is true for you guys, we are thinking of comic book shops and direct market comics, right? That is comics to us. Or me, anyhow. I am maybe unfairly throwing you under the same bus with me. And so when I say comics, that is what I am talking about. But I'm also aware that of the arguably 4 markets that exist in U.S. comics, let alone on a worldwide thing, the direct market comics is the smallest chunk of it, right? Like, you've got Webtoons, where I do Urban Animal, and Urban Animal has 475,000 subscribers, and we have a weekly readership of around 100K, 80 to 100,000, which is on a par readership-wise, and it's free, so it is apples to oranges, I am fully aware, but it is on a par with the top-selling comic in the direct market in any given month. And so there's that, and then you look at like the bookstore and library market, right? And you've got Dave Pilkey, who does Dogman, and you've got Raina Telgemeier, who did Smile and Guts and Drama and all those. And so, for instance, Dave Pilkey, his newest Dogman book, which is absolutely a comic book. It is for kids, but it is 1,000% a comic. Had a 5 million copy print run for its initial printing. In any given year for the last few years, Dave Pilkey has sold several million trades himself. So those are just these massive markets that the direct market is almost entirely separate from. It is one of those things where if you go into a lot of comic book shops and you say Dave Pilkey or Raina, you will just not get a reaction. They don't know what you're talking about because that is just separate animals. And the other market is manga, and even then, when they bring out a new thing of like My Hero Academia or One Punch Man, it's 60 or 100,000 copies right out of the gate for a collected edition. And I think for direct market comics, that way that it is a separate enclosed bubble is bad for us. In terms of, I think our market would grow if there were a pipeline from those other markets in, but they're almost entirely separate from direct market comics. And I see that with Urban Animal in the fact that like, I get almost no recognition, until this Kickstarter actually, many of my peers and friends didn't know I had this Webtoons thing, let alone that it is by far the most widely read thing in my career by probably a factor of magnitude. You know what I mean? Like in direct comics, like if I'm known for anything, I'm known for Luther Strode and Spread, and just in sheer readership, Urban Animal was easily 10 times that of what they had. And that's remarkable to me, and it's been interesting. I haven't gotten any sort of negative aspects of it, but it has really highlighted for me how siloed various markets of sequential storytelling really are.
Speaking of web comics, and I'm definitely speaking for myself, my first conscious exposure to webtoons and web comics, I'd probably say was Sanford Green when he was doing the Action Comic 1000.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I think that was my probably first conscious exposure that got me into looking into webtoons and things like that.
Mine was Darby, the little angry T-Rex.
Darby.
I think it's Sherrard Jackson, I think.
Awesome. Yeah, he did Darby. The people that we're doing the Kickstarter with to bring out Urban Animal also did the print edition of Darby.
Oh, nice.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Justin, I wanted to know what was maybe your first conscious exposure to the Webtoons platform or web comics, and what was the catalyst to get your project Urban Animal going? Oh,
so those are two separate answers for me because I have a mild case of old. Honestly, my first exposure to webcomics was probably stuff like I want to say American Elf by James Kolchaka way back when. And there was a guy named Merlin, I can't remember his last name now, who did some really cool, really innovative comics. This is all circa 20 years ago, right? So, and then it's less traditional web comics, but it was stuff like Dinosaur Comics by Ryan North and that sort of thing. And then I think the first thing I really started reading kind of online when she was posting it up was Carla Speed McNeil's Finder, which I still quite like. And then I sort of moved in that. The thing that kind of inspired me about wanting to do webcomics, aside from there are some like mercenary sort of things in there, in that if I can do webcomics, I can, get readers and kind of get them into my ecosystem. But I also really liked and really like Kill 6 Billion Demons, which is awesome. And if you have not read it and you like my stuff, I assure you, you will like Kill 6 Billion Demons, which is free to read online, and Image actually does the collected trades of it. So with Webtoons, I became familiar that Webtoons existed in the South Korean market, which is where it originally from. I had not actually started reading any of them until they started working their way into the American market, which is where I ultimately landed with them.
Let me ask you this then. Do you think that the format of webcomics, as it's kind of portrayed from what I read with Darby and your stuff as well, do you think it gives sort of like the illusion of consuming something more quickly? Maybe, I don't know, like I feel like it's kind of garnered popularity because of that in this day and age, because you can just sit here and swipe up, and it's like it almost kind of mirrors like the tension of like, oh my gosh, like that might be the new way of pages being turned, like it's like a psychological response to where like, oh man, I can't wait to get to turn the page. Oh, then we're going to, turn the page. Now it's like swipe up. Oh yeah, swipe up, swipe up. And do you think the format of webcomics offers new ways essentially to tell stories from a sequential aspect?
It absolutely does. And it changes what you can do in comics, right? So like for instance, to go back to the horror thing, not that you can't do horror in comics, because a lot of people tend to think of horror as just things like jump scares and that sort of thing, which do not really work in comics. There's a lot more to horror than that, but that is a rabbit hole I could go down. But things like webtoons allow you to actually kind of effectively do a jump scare to a certain extent, because essentially every panel, if you want it to be, is a page turn reveal. And that allows you to do things with pacing that are nearly impossible to do in print comics unless you're willing to eat up a tremendous amount of page, to do it.
Right.
But I could have, reveal after reveal after reveal in a webtoons, and the stuff doesn't need to be happening on a page turn and that kind of stuff. And by the same account, you can also adjust within reason the size of the scroll, right? Like you can pace out how quickly a reader is going to be moving through the comic in a way that is difficult to control in comics. You can do it, but it again eats up panels and eats up space. So it ends up being sort of a fundamentally different experience. What I've also found to be true is that Webtoons readers, in particular to Webtoons, have different expectations about comics. I want to say it is more manga inspired, and I think that may be true, but I may also be talking out of my ass. But they are way more okay. If I want to have a episode of Urban Animal that is like 40% just people having a conversation, that is totally cool in a way that if I did that in a print comic, I would probably get my ass chewed out in some sense for it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And certainly I feel that way. And so, yeah, it's that different expectations and that kind of stuff. And it is also, to go back to what you were saying earlier, it is also a kind of hyper serialized format. You know,
right.
Each of these episodes is roughly equivalent to 6 to 10 pages of a comic, but it's still a chunk of content, a chunk of story that you are consuming very quickly. And that kind of shows from week to week. It is funny. It's interesting. So Webtoons has the unique quality, and it may literally be unique because it might be the only place on the internet where this is true, that the comment section is not like sticking your face in a weed whacker to go in. One of the things that is different about Webtoons is that you get a lot more immediate feedback and a lot more of it than you do in a print comic. We are not doing Urban Animal week to week, so it's not as if we do it and we immediately get feedback. But like, we do it and we get feedback and like several hundred comments of it a month or two afterwards, right? Whereas in comics, you might get people tweeting you, or they might come up to a con, or they might send you email, but it is 6 months, a year after you've done it. It is way distant. That is webcomics is immediate in a way that print comics are not. But one thing that I have seen from that is that you have a lot of people who are super into the comic and they really know the storyline, but like completely forget what character names are despite them just having read it. And I think that is actually a function of the speed and the amount of which they consume. I think most Webtoons readers are not just reading Urban Animal. They're reading a bunch of stuff. And I think that's just what they do. And so there is this sort of pace to it that is different than print comics. And the way they interact with it is different. It is, I do know for a fact, a fairly different sort of breakdown in terms of demographics, in terms of ages, and even gender. It tends to be different than what you get in print comics and direct market comics.
So, along with all of the hurdles you were talking about and rewards, can you shed some light on maybe some of the hurdles and rewards that come with working with a visual artist? Like, how important is the communication in that process? Anything you can talk about?
Oh, it's extremely important. And, you know, some of the secret sauce for Urban Animal is the fact that John Amore, the artist, and I have known each other for like 15 years. So, you know, that is a thing. It is interesting. I've been very lucky in that on many of my creator-owned projects, especially, I've been able to work with artists who I kind of got into an immediate groove with. You know, on Luther Strode, me and Trad and Felipe would joke about the hive mind because we would basically always all be thinking the same thing. So cool. It worked out really nicely, and it is very, very handy to be able to kind of get in a groove with somebody, and it really streamlines the process on the writing end. So were you to see scripts and stuff for Urban Animal, you would find that most panel descriptions in it are maybe a sentence, just because I know what John's going to do and John knows what I want. So there's not much need to like kind of fluff it up. That is not always the case. You know, that is one of the things that ends up being very different between work for hire comics and creator owned oftentimes is on work for hire comics, especially for Marvel and DC, you are very often can be writing a script not knowing who is going to draw it. And, you know, you not only do you not know who's going to draw it, you don't know if English is going to be their first language, which actually is a subtler problem than I think people appreciate, because even if somebody doesn't speak English as their first language, even if they speak English flawlessly, they are not necessarily familiar with idiom and colloquialisms. You know what I mean? So if it's like, you know, he was dead as a doornail. Like, that may well be just like, what the fuck is he talking about? That shit. Like, how do I draw that? Do I need to draw a doornail? You know, that's a bad example, but that kind of stuff comes up. There's an interesting bit. So Peter David, who wrote a billion issues of the Hulk, wrote a book on comic book writing, and he talks about one time he was working on a thing, and he described an incoming comet as looking like a death's head in the sky, and he was being metaphorical, of course. But the guy actually drew a comet that looked like a skull, which actually looked fucking metal as fuck, right? Like, I and Peter David in the book admitted that it was cool. It was just not what the scene called for. But that is actually a thing that can happen, and if you don't know who you're writing for, you have to write differently than you would if for somebody that you have created a true partnership with. You know what I mean? And it's why I think you get better results when you are able to work consistently with the same artist on the same project. And that has really been to the great benefit of Urban Animal for us, which, you know, was originally John's concept. You know, we had pitched something else to Webtoons, which they pointed out incredibly accurately was not appropriate for Webtoons. Not in a it's too adult sense. It's just the story we were telling did not lend itself to the format that Webtoons tells stories. And they were correct. And so we were talking about pitching them something else because they did like John's art and they liked me. And so John had this Urban Animal concept, which was, you know, the basics of Joe and his friends and the band and that kind of stuff. So we worked together to kind of create the mythology and the story and stuff behind it. And so what you get when you see Urban Animal is a really true collaboration between us, but it's one that's enabled by knowing each other and having worked together in the past a lot. We worked together on a bunch of projects that entirely didn't see the light of day, but we have known and been friends for a long time that made that what it is.
As far as like storytelling, I actually watched an interview you did where you basically said you read Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing way too young, which cracked me up because some of those pictures I can remember giving me nightmares as well. Are there any storytellers that resonate with you and John when you guys were making Urban Animal, and why?
It's one of those things where it has been more influenced by certain projects, rather than specific storytellers, which is a little unusual for me. I'm usually influenced by specific creators rather than projects. But as I said, Buffy the Vampire Slayer was a big factor in it. We also, there's some of the old school sort of Spider-Man, particularly. Honestly, it seems like a weird thing to mention. It's probably drawing from the Spider-Man strip that Stan Lee did that appeared in the Electric Company magazine when I was a kid. That may still be in the Electric Company magazine if it exists. I know Stan Lee's brother took it over some years ago and was working through it. But it has also got, there are aspects of nope, I'm blanking on the one anime's name, but there's some anime stuff in there. So like there is, for my part, definitely some like My Hero Academia kind of thrown in there and mixed in there. And, we took some of the lore approach that kind of manga in general has had. And John, depending on things, has drawn from different stuff. Like sometimes he is drawing from Mike Mignola, like that, particularly like that opening scene where you were mentioning Dracula and stuff is probably, I would say, very heavily Mignola inspired. And we have grabbed some other stuff like that. And, John could probably answer that more thoroughly on the art side. I know we have chatted about his inspirations for stuff, and it is just, my brain is shot these days. So I probably would be remiss to try to speak on his behalf. But yeah, certainly for me, it's been, kind of a combination of that sort of stuff. And honestly, a thing that is sort of, I didn't really think about how much of the creative DNA is in it until I rewatched it recently. But like there is a crap ton of Avatar: The Last Airbender worked in there, just nice. in terms of how they're approaching character arcs and the overarching mythology.
Justin, you are one of a handful of creators who's not only worked extensively in the direct market for the big two, but you've dabbled in work for hire projects for the bookstore market and now digital. I was curious, based on your experience, do you favor maybe one market over the other? And is there any noticeable difference in maybe how you approach your business or maybe even writing process in a direct market versus, say, digital space?
Yeah. So, it's interesting. When you ask me what I prefer, it's sort of it is a hard question to answer. Like what I want to default to is that I prefer the direct market. And in a sense, that is true in that I still have this love of comic book shops and of getting the single issues and of cracking them open and the smell of new comics and that sort of stuff. And I'm big into the actual physical thing itself, which, until now, Urban Animal has not had. But what I have found from doing those, and this is the creative aspect of things rather than the business aspect of things, is from a creative standpoint, working on the graphic novels, the original graphic novels, so that I am not writing something that is serialized and writing something that is hyper serialized have made me realize that, and this is probably my own doing, is that I was and am constrained in a way by doing single issues serialization, like 20-page chunks, that is probably not my best writing. You know what I mean? I've written some really good stuff, I think, in the direct market, but I like my stuff better when I am operating outside of the constraints that I feel on there. And like I said, I think that is self-generated. I have this thing where, and I don't regret this, but when I'm doing something that is appearing in singles first, I am basically really endeavoring to make sure that while each of those issues is not necessarily telling a complete story, they often don't, because, arc-based storytelling, I do want a complete chunk of entertainment for the reader, right? Like I need it to hit certain beats. I need it to have a climax. I need it, to do a bunch of stuff. And that's good. But at least for me, that is also to a certain extent limiting, because there is just space that I don't feel comfortable giving stuff that I do when you do in a graphic novel and that sort of thing. It's kind of the difference between, I would venture that is actually the difference between watching like a 15-minute show and watching a 2-hour movie. When you're doing a movie, although you want any given bit of it to be interesting, you have different expectations than you would if you're watching something that is truly episodic. Which is funny. It's people come up and they'll talk about stuff like Scorsese did The Irishman, and it's like, I don't know, 3 hours long or whatever. And people are like, I don't have time to watch that. And they're like, well, you can binge whatever. I'm like, yeah, but psychologically, those are not the same thing. Like, they really aren't, because television shows are, even ones that are bingeable, are designed for each episode to be its own chunk of a thing. And that is actually a different mental load than a story that is actually telling itself entirely as one thing over 3 hours. Like, those are not actually the same animal. And so I get that. And that is what, graphic novels kind of made me realize that. I realize this is a rambling answer to that. But the same way is, oddly, the hyper serialized nature of webtoons also put that in focus for me, because despite webtoons episodes being only 6 to 10 pages essentially of comic book, because the expectations are different and because the experience is different, I am a lot more willing to kind of go into the weeds of the relationships and have a lot more quieter moments that I find myself avoiding in single issue comics. And so I have kind of found that I really like doing those things. And honestly, one of those things is, and I'm going to get into the weeds of the considerations you make when you do comic books professionally, is if you do something as a graphic novel into the direct market, especially, if you do it as an OGN, you are eliminating revenue. Like, you just are. It's one of those deals that if you do it as single issues first, even if they're only middlingly successful, you are adding thousands of dollars to your bottom line. And in comics, where money is typically an issue, that is something to be worth considered. And so if we do this book, like, I've got to think about, do we want to do it as singles first and maximize our chances of being able to tell the full story we want to tell, and have enough to make the artist be able to actually eat while they're doing it, which is the big concern. I work on 8,000 projects, so, I can afford to take a hit. But an artist, if they want to do a series and we want to do 25 issues, even if they're only doing 6 issues, I've eaten up a year of their life, right? So they need to get paid first. So them getting paid is a concern more than it is for me for any given project. And so with this one, I have to look at, in an ideal world, because of the world building and the stuff we need to do, it would work better as graphic novels, as a series of original graphic novels. On the other hand, if I want to maximize our chances of actually putting out all 5 of those that we would like to do, I should probably do it as singles. And those necessitate 2 different kinds of writing. You know, it is written differently. I'm not going to write a graphic novel and then just arbitrarily chunk it up into 20-page or 24-page chunks. It's not what I do. And I'm not going to start. And so that's sort of the cold equation of stuff that you have to do. And, you know, I've gone way down this rabbit hole, but like that's some of the things you have to consider, and I have to consider about projects. But you know, creatively and for my own satisfaction, I think I would prefer to do original graphic novels.
I noticed that was pretty prevalent in your press release was the your experience with all of these markets. I wanted to put a spotlight on that, and I thought you did fantastic. It's definitely prevalent that a lot of comic book fans only see the direct market as exactly what you said, the comic shop, but we're in 2020, and that is not the case. It has quickly evolved. There's so many channels, and Webtoons has definitely piqued my interest, and I see that being, if not a game changer already, definitely more of a dominant force in the years to come.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's one of those things it kind of frustrates me about direct market comics is that comics are fine. The direct market is a little iffy, and the direct market, I wouldn't be one of those people like the direct market is going to die. The COVID thing does concern me, right? Because we don't have a lot of comic book shops, and they tend to be, they're small businesses which are in a precarious position to begin with, but they're also, oftentimes they're small businesses in the sense of these are not people who are businessmen and women first. They are fans first. And that means we're always on this razor edge of something like this, or like if Diamond were to collapse, could spiral out. Like that is not an unreasonable thing to be afraid of. And that's the thing. Like, in a sort of macro sense, I don't think comics in the direct market are dying quickly, but I don't think we are adding new fans as fast as we are going to be losing old ones just through death, honestly, and that kind of thing. You know what I mean? It's one of those things so one of the things I will say is if you like Urban Animal or you think you'll like Urban Animal, you start at 1 and you go to whatever we're at. If you like One Piece, you start at volume 1 and go to volume 4,732 or whatever One Piece is up to now. And that is most of fiction, and comics is not that way. If you asked me, a professional nerd who has literally read comics for 40 years, said, hey, I really like that Robert Pattinson Batman movie. What should I read? Where do I start with Batman? I cannot answer that. And it's the same way with Spider-Man or Incredible Hulk. Although, you know, there are instances that maybe work. I could maybe recommend Dark Knight Returns or something. But in general, we have created content and an ecosystem that is sort of impenetrable to new fans, much less like reaching out to them. Like, even if they are interested, we have made it really difficult to become a fan of what the direct market offers, which is a shame. You know, the analogy I've used a few times is, I think, and I don't mean this in an insulting way, I think that fundamentally direct market comics and single issues are essentially vinyl. They're sort of a niche format, but in order to be viable as that niche, they need to be part of a bigger ecosystem, right? Like vinyl now would not work if streaming and radio and digital downloads didn't exist. They need that to feed into the vinyl market. Comics needs that, and those other markets exist, but they're not feeding down into the direct market. And part of that is not only are we are vinyl that is only offering or primarily offering German death reggae as our content. And so we've made it really hard for people to transition in. And that's a problem. That's not a thing to say that we should stop doing direct market comics, that we should stop producing things for that fan base, but we also need to be bigger than that, or we will never be bigger than that.
So let me ask you a little, not to get off that track.
No, get off that track. I went for 48 minutes in that answer.
Dude, so they're there for everybody that's listening is here for you, not for us. But that said, where are you from, man? Like, where'd you grow up?
I grew up in rural Pennsylvania.
Oh, nice. My uncle lives in Lansdale, so we visit him every now and then. Do you think that, like, do you claim it, or is that like, That's not me anymore. That town, I've moved away and gone all cosmopolitan. And if you,
I haven't fucking moved away is the thing. So,
Awesome.
like, I would be very disingenuous to say that I am still in the county where I am originally from.
this is you could hear it in your voice, man. So let me ask you this: Does that have any sort of effect on your writing and your hustle and how you basically conduct yourself as a professional, your work? Does it interfere in any way?
It absolutely has an effect. I wouldn't say that it interferes necessarily.
Or
but
influences more appropriately.
It does. It does influence, and it has pluses and minuses. And some of them are creative and some of them are pragmatic. But I live in rural Pennsylvania. I live in I live in Bedford County, PA, which almost no one has ever heard of, even within Pennsylvania, because we apparently have an infinite number of counties. I don't know, like once a year I get some county mentioned that despite living in Pennsylvania my whole life, I'm like, I've never fucking heard of that place before. So it is the kind of Rust Belty area. I live in the Appalachians, and it was a coal mining town, and the mines have long since gone out. And so that has all that it entails, but part of it is that it is extremely cheap to live here. I own my house outright. I don't pay rent. My monthly nut is small because I don't really have any place to go or any place to spend money on, which is very good for productivity. And it is very good for allowing me to have established a comic book career, because I had, I didn't have the same sort of monetary needs that other people did. I've done fairly well in comics and stuff, but certainly starting out, I was able to work as hard as I did and do what I did because my cost of living was really cheap. That is not a thing that somebody living in New York City can do.
Sure.
But it gives me, it is interesting. I find, and this applies to the creative aspect of that question, is I find that, so I live in an area that is Appalachian, and it was a coal mining thing. And then when the coal mines went in, factories went out, and then the factories went out, and nothing has come in, and nothing is likely to come in. So by waiver, for instance, I'm 42, so I've got a medium case of old, but I'm not old. And when I was in high school, the town I went to high school in, which is not where I live, but it's nearby, had a main street with storefronts. It had several restaurants. It had 2 gas stations. There were 3 factories and a bottling plant. That is all gone. There is 1 gas station and 1 restaurant and the bunch of empty storefronts on Main Street. All the factories are gone. The elementary school that I actually went to has been closed and sold. 2 of the 3 that fed into my high school, which obviously was not a large high school, have closed. And there is something about seeing the area that you are from hollowed out that way that it gives me a different perspective on my writing, and for sure influences what I'm interested in writing about. It is, to get all fancy about it, like when you live around here, you kind of see the death of the American dream. And I think it gives you this perspective on how kind of temporary and fragile things are. And I think for me personally, you see that reflected in my writing a lot. Not necessarily an urban animal, but like, in things like Strode and those kind of things, it actually does work in subtle ways. So the shorter answer to that is, aside from practical considerations, my writing would be different if I lived somewhere else, just because my environment would be different and I would be seeing and thinking about different things, I'm pretty sure. So I think I would do a different kind of writing. I don't think it would necessarily be better or worse. I just think the things that I would be interested in and the things that I would focus on would not be the same.
No, of course. And I find that most people in the creative vein, like where they're at, where their culture is, tends to influence their hustle. And both Botter and I can tell that your game is real.
One of our catchphrases here on the show for the longest time has been, the struggle is real.
Right.
And me and C, prior to hopping on this call, we were both like, Justin Jordan, that's a hustler.
No joke.
He's been all, he's had his hand in everything. He's been, very successful in almost everything he's touched. And I know we've got aspiring writers who are listening. And, we've covered things like, at least your experience and your success with Webtoon, licensing, Kickstarter, the creator-owned route. And I was wondering if you had any maybe particular direction in regards to a platform or how these aspiring writers could possibly go about making writing their full-time position. I understand that could probably be its own episode in its own way, but is there
tackle that in 2 sentences, Justin, if you could.
But I wonder if maybe you have a go-to piece of advice for aspiring writers who want to make writing their main time, full-time hustle.
I do. I mean, I don't know this is my go-to advice, but I do think I have an answer to that. And it actually, it relates to the hustle. And actually, to go back to the other question, I got into comics not late in a general sense, but I was in my 30s before I broke into comics. And, I went through a lot of crappy ass jobs, and then I got a chance to do what I wanted to do. And I basically grabbed on with both hands and all available toes and my teeth to not fall back out of it, which is where that hustle comes from. I'm also always trying to outrun the demons of not being in the industry anymore because I'm essentially unemployable now otherwise. But I think one of the things that helped me early on, there's some practical advice that I give people, which is you need to write and you need to finish things. You need to set them aside, start new things and finish those. And you need to, as soon as you can, start trying to get things drawn. And it will not necessarily, very likely, at the beginning of when you try to do that, it will not be the best artists or the people that are going to get you in an image comic or that sort of thing. But you need to be doing the thing that you want to do all along. You know what I mean? It's not one of those deals that you have to write a tremendous amount each day. But I know a lot of people who hypothetically want to write and they mostly think about writing, or they spend a lot of time doing world building, which I have described as world building as masturbation, because it feels good but doesn't actually get you anywhere. And avoiding doing that, making sure you're actually producing the work and that you're actually trying to get things drawn. And once you try to get things drawn, try to get them published. I did 10 years in, small and self-publishing and anthologies and that kind of stuff, which I really liked and think is a foundational part of my career. But it is also, so all that ties into what I did and what I still do, which is, there's the cliched Gretzky quote of you miss all the shots you don't take, but man, luck is a thing, right? It is not enough to be good. You also need to be lucky. And it's lucky in the sense of you just don't know there's so many things that are outside of your control. Like when I send a pitch in, it could be that somebody else has sent in the exact same pitch and they already said yes the day before, or it could be that the editor's having a bad day, and it could be. There's a lot of it could be's. I can't control that. What I can control is the sheer volume of stuff that I try to get going, right? And so over the years, I've done 15 or 16 creator-owned series. I have lost count. But I have probably pitched more like 50. And that is part of it, is you need to just keep taking those shots. A lot of people think one thing is one shot, and then, if it doesn't work out, then it sucks and they're not going to be able to do this. And, you may not be able to do it, but you absolutely will not know that until you've spent a decade doing as many different shots to try and let luck happen to you as you can. So persistence and kind of volume, for lack of a better term, I think are actually my best advice about making a career. And then, once you get a foothold in, you need to try to maximize that. And, it's one of those things where by design, I've continued to try to do creator-owned work over the years just because, I like doing it. And as I mentioned, me wanting to do something and it's fun tends to be one of the dominant things. But there is also the fact that unless you are somebody who, unless you're Scott Snyder working on Detective Comics and then Batman, or you're Tom King doing Miracle Man, Mr. Miracle. Tom King doing Miracle Man would also be really cool, but that's a separate thing.
Indeed.
Unless you're that, by and large, you are not going to be known for the work for hire work that you do. To fans you are, but within the industry and stuff, I am not getting work off to this day. I'm not getting work off the back of having done Deathstroke, Team 7, or even Green Lantern, New Guardians. I get work because I did Strode, Spread, Reaver, and Dead Body Road, right?
Nice.
So keeping that stuff, even aside from any creative things, once you're in, you need to keep creating new stuff. You need to not just be a journeyman working for business interests. You need to be pursuing your own thing. And you need to do that if for no other reason, I think, than to have longevity in the work for hire aspect of it. So basically, work hard, do a lot of stuff, take a lot of shots, and once you get in, don't stop doing the things that got you in.
Fantastic. That's some good insight. See, you could learn something.
No, it's funny. I'm writing all this down, and I'm also bouncing it off of stuff my old man has said. Like, you just clock in and work on time, and it's 90% of the job. And it's like, yeah, I think Justin covered it, Dad. Yeah, thanks. Thanks.
No, it is. It's funny. There's a strength coach guy that I like his stuff. And it's not just because I lift. Like, he's just kind of wise, right? And he's really has said, he's made this emphasis. He's like, man, the first thing is to show up. He's like, there's so many things in life that, like, just being there, like, you need to hit that level first. And people don't, right? Like, he would talk about, he was, and actually is, he's a master's athlete now. He's in his 60s, but he was a very good collegiate discus thrower and a high school thrower. And there would always be people being like, well, if so-and-so was here, they'd have beat you. And he's like, yeah, but so-and-so didn't show up, so I won, And that, and the older I get, the more that resonates with me, is that a lot of it is just actually being there and, putting in the work, but it's also putting yourself out there to be the person. You know what I mean? It's that the shots you don't take thing all over again. So yeah, me and your old man are simpatico on that one.
I knew it.
So Justin, here on the Short Box, we recognize our most important aspect of the show is not us, much to our own, depth of our ego. It is our listeners, and we like to make them feel a part of the show as much as possible. We tried this in our last interview, and it was a lot of fun, so I'd like to extend the honors to you as well. It should come as no surprise that we have a lot of fans of your work who tune in, so we have a few questions from them that we'd like to share with you. These are questions from the citizens of the Short Box Nation. The first one comes from a good friend of ours, Austin Ellis. He asked, how did you and Trad Moore originally connect to create Luther Strode?
Basically, I had come up with the idea for Luther Strode, and I knew that I wanted somebody with Ryan Otley type energy. This was 10 years ago when Ryan was sort of towards the beginning of his run on Invincible. It didn't need to be somebody whose stuff looked like Ryan Otley, but if you've read Invincible, when I talk about the energy, you know what I'm talking about.
Oh yeah.
I was sort of generally looking for somebody, but I actually happened to be on DeviantArt, and I was just fucking around looking at Hunter Bullets fan art, because Hunter Bullets is one of my favorite comics. And I saw some pages, and it turned out that Trad went to the Savannah College of Art and Design, SCAD, as have a number of collaborators I've worked with. Because once I got my clutches on, got Trad in my clutches, I basically worked my way through his friends group to collaborate with. And he had done like a 10-page original story for a class that was a thing with Lano, a 100 Bullets thing. And of course, it's Trad. His art was fucking awesome. So I followed that back to his profile, and I looked at his stuff. I'm like, he'd be terrific for Luther Strode, and he actually had his contact information available. So I emailed him.
He showed up,
and then we had Luther Strode. Now the secret sauce to that, whenever I tell that story, and this relates to what I said earlier, is so. I sent Trad an email, and it said, "Hey, I'm Justin Jordan. I saw your work here. I really like this. I have this idea. And I gave him like a 1-sentence Luther Strode thing. If that's something you want to hear more about, let me know, and I'll send you samples of my work and a more detailed, fleshed out thing." And he was interested, and I had gone over kind of, how much stuff I did. And one of the things that led Trad to saying yes to it was that by the time I pitched Trad, I had probably 200 odd pages of pitches, short stories, and all that kind of stuff. I had built up a body of work, even though I had not broken into, mainstream publishing. I was able to show him that I had skill and that I had the ability to work with people and that I was not going to waste his time. And I think it is really easy to underestimate how important all those things were in getting him to say yes. But we did that, and then in the Image, because people asked this too, we submitted through their submissions email, and they said yes in an unreasonably short period of time.
Wow.
And Image is funny because the entire response from Eric Stevenson, who is famously terse, was, "Yeah, we'll publish this." And I was convinced that I had misinterpreted it right up until they sent me the first issues we printed, I think.
Wow. Surprise, dude. So the next question, I'm going to keep it, no surprise, Luther Strode related. This comes from another early championer. Is that a word, championer?
It is now.
Championer
it is now.
of your work. This question comes from Nick Wagner. He says, on the third series, The Legacy of Luther Strode, the book had to take a break around issue 3 or 4. Was this strictly because the art had gotten too wild and labor-intensive, or was it time you needed to mold the finale of the story as well? Personally, I loved that they delayed the story for quality purposes rather than sticking to a deadline that would have compromised the final product.
No, that was because we needed to get the art right. So I had already written everything by that point, but we basically just underestimated how much time it would take us. Because, if you've read Legacy of Luther Strode, it is fucking wild. And Trad did some incredible work there. And
he just kept leveling up.
We should have waited another couple of months to start putting the series out. Is the truth. We just kind of whiffed it. And it's funny because we actually managed to get that right on the other ones. We didn't not have any delays for the first 15 issues of Strode. And then round about the midpoint of that one, we're we need more time than we allotted. So.
All right. So this next one isn't Luther Strode related. But it's from Andrew Torres. He writes, how did it feel to write Green Lantern New Guardians following Jeff Johns' iconic run?
It was fun. I was not following Jeff on that title. I was following Jeff in the general sense that he was the head of the Green Lantern books. I was specifically following Tony Bedard, I think, on that title. But, it was both daunting and actually pretty relaxing because on one hand, Jeff was leading the Green Lantern group and, his Green Lantern was setting the tone for what all those books were. And when he left, basically everybody left. They rebooted. They didn't reboot them. We continued with numbering, but they basically had new creative teams on all the books. And so you're in a big shadow for something like that, because that is probably Jeff's kind of thing that I suspect he is still very much known for. On the other hand, because we were kind of following along after Jeff, they kind of didn't pay attention to what we were doing past our immediate editors. So we kind of got to do what we wanted. And it was actually a super pleasant experience because everybody that was working on those books at that time, which had ended up being me and Robert Venditti and Charles Soule and then Cullen eventually, we were all sort of friends. We are all friends. And it worked out well. And we also knew what the demands were, right? So we started off with a crossover called Lights Out. And we knew just by the nature of how DC books were being done then, and in about a year, we would need to do another crossover. But because we were all friendly, because we all communicated, we were able to actually keep ourselves updated on what was going on in our various books and build towards that next crossover in an organic way. So that, I think, actually turned out to be a really cohesive stretch in the Green Lantern universe, and it was really cool to be able to get to do it. I still think I was a weird fucking choice to be asked to come on, but I am glad they did.
They knocked it out of the park. I will admit, I was like, Justin Jordan's doing Green Lantern? And then when I eventually got around to your series, I was like, oh, never mind. Smart choice. I needed a breath of fresh air.
Okay. Yeah, I basically took the Star Trek approach to it, where we're going to visit new planets and have new weird moral quandaries and just sci-fi the shit out of this.
There we go.
People seem to dig it. So
there we go.
No, absolutely. All right, Justin, this last one comes from, that's weird, a Botter Milligan. That's weird.
Dumbass. You've been asking questions this whole time. You're like,
yeah. Well, he writes, or I wanted to ask, I came across that post that you referenced earlier in our chat on Facebook, where you wrote, it's about that time for my quarterly attempt to get DC to let me write Lobo.
Oh, yeah.
And I was curious, what other characters or properties would you love to get your hands on, whether they're in the big two or even outside of that?
Yeah. Other than the main man.
Oh, so there are a few. So DC, fairly regularly pitch them. I was not kidding about that quarterly attempt at Lobo. I do actually pitch them that about 4 times a year, about every 3 months. Just, just because fuck it.
They probably got a filter. They probably got a filter by now. Like, oh, it's around that
probably.
time.
Well, see, you say that, but they've now got like new management. So, right?
You're
the
like,
clock's reset.
You have to say, you're like Mr. Mixia's Pitlick coming back every 3 months. And they somehow managed to make you say your name backwards.
Yeah, exactly. Right back to the 4th dimension or 5th dimension for me. But yeah, I also pitch them Bane semi-regularly, and that is, it's funny. It's one of those things that they're also fairly. It's not that they dislike what I have, what I would like to do with Bane. It's just that Bane is always used somewhere else. But I have a cool take on Bane that I think would be really cool. And I also would, and this is DC right now because I was just thinking about that in regards to Lobo. I would actually really like to do Azrael. I love the character, and I think there's cool stuff to be done with the mythology of the Order of Saint Dumas and that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And then I also pitched them fairly recently Spectre thing that I thought was pretty cool. So those characters are all of interest to me. I would like to write. I think I've got a good Punisher run in me. I really like Kingpin and Daredevil in that order, kinda. So either one of those I think would be actually pretty rad. Outside of that, there's probably not a lot of stuff that I'm interested in. It's funny. It's a weird question to answer because there is some stuff that, like, I think it would be kind of rad to turn into like a television show that's not comic stuff. Like I am actually literally looking at it on my bookshelf. So Jim Starlin about 30 years ago did this book called Among Madmen that I think would make a terrific fucking television show. It's about basically a big chunk of the population, like 50%, just starts going randomly insane and nobody's sure why. And they tend to kind of split into either people that just go catatonic or what they call berserkers who become violent. But it's not like they become violent like the rage virus in 28 Days Later. Like it's, for instance, and I'm spoiling a 30-year-old book that like 11 people have read, but the main character's wife turns out to be a berserker. But basically anytime, and this is also a book from 30 years ago by Jim Starlin, which factors into this. Basically, he can't resist her. So anytime they have sex, the next morning she tries to murder him. And that is how her insanity manifests. But the rest of the time, as long as he prevents her from murdering him, she's perfectly fine. But it's that kind of iterations of insanity. And it's sort of it's not quite a post-apocalyptic situation because the world is limping along, but this is necessarily like fucked up society. And it's a cool novel, and I like it, but I'm like, man, there is so much cool like shit you could do with that if you were doing like a Walking Dead style television show with it, I think. So there's random stuff like that I would kind of like to get my fingers on.
That sounds just like a Jim Starlin story. Yeah. I'm not even like surprised. Actually, speaking about television and production, this comes from a Izzy Delbs via Instagram. We had posted a question. Hey, send us a question you'd like to ask Justin Jordan. And his question is, who is your ideal person to be cast as Luther Strode?
Oh
God, I don't know. I don't know because a lot of years have passed between me originally doing Strode, and I am sort of out of the knowing who the actors are who would be relevant to play. I think someone, and he's probably aged out of it, but somebody like Liam Hemsworth probably would not have been a bad choice. But I think it would be a matter of finding somebody who could plausibly bulk up, but also could embody sort of the nerdy aspects of it. Ironically, the guy who played Kick-Ass in the movie version of it, the actor's name escapes me. He's also in Godzilla and was Avengers Age of Ultron. Would actually have made a very really cool Luther Strode as well, especially because in Kick-Ass 2 he actually did get pretty fucking jacked, and he really looked like Luther Strode, but he also has that sweetness and vulnerability underneath that I think is key to Strode. So finding that sort of mix of thing would be difficult. I don't have a good answer to that question, and I've talked with Hollywood people about Strode, so it is something I think about, and I'm like, I don't know. You need to show me 800 people in the right broad age range. I will say, one thing that me and Trad have talked about is that I don't think Luther Strode necessarily needs to be a blonde white kid. You know what I mean? I think there's probably no particular reason he needs to look that way. I think, the physicality and the sensitivity of it are far more important than sort of the other superficial stuff. And there's probably added depth that could be there if we changed, race or something like that about it. But that would be a bringing somebody on who can tell that story authentically in the writing process, I think would be part of that.
This reminds me of I think it's the opening scene of Chasing Amy when they're at the comic book convention, and you can see Mike Allred talking to a fan, and his words are, I really like Chow Yun-fat, but I don't know if he's a good choice for Madman. It's like such a throwaway line, but it always makes me laugh because it's such a question that like fans like Botter and I are always like, yo, but if you could have this guy be in the movie, like what would he be, man? Like who would you pick? And it's always like, the writer or the artist is kind of put on the spot, like, I don't know if Liam Neeson would be good for Marvel's slapstick, but
fuck it. I'm changing my answer. Liam Neeson for Luther Strode.
Justin, my cheat code when it comes to those questions is I always preface any of my answers with, a young version of place actor who has obviously aged out. But I will say, Justin, I'm going to pass you my number after this. If you guys do decide to go ahead and make Luther Strode a white kid, I'm right here for you.
Bump that. I'm going to write my number on top of that as another non-white guy.
All right. Justin, we are nearing the end of our show, but before we wrap up and let you plug Urban Animal, we have a tradition here on the show, a segment. It is called Champion Season. It is our opportunity to let our guests champion something within pop culture. So this could be a movie, a comic book, a book, music, television
anything.
show, anything that you are currently really hype about that you want to share with the world in hopes that maybe someone else will check it out.
Whatever you're vibing, man.
Oh, I think the thing that I probably have enjoyed most recently was The Boys television show on Amazon, which is surprising because I actually do not like The Boys comic. So I have this love-hate relationship with Garth Ennis's work. Not with the man. We get along fine the couple of times we've interacted. But there's Garth Ennis who has done The Punisher and did things like the war stories and Hitman, and I love that Garth Ennis. And then there's Garth Ennis who did parts of Preacher and did The Boys, who has this like kind of, for better or for worse, teenage boy sense of humor that I don't vibe with. And The Boys the show is actually fascinating because especially the first season was actually a fairly close adaptation while also improving on the book for me, for what I like in it and finding richness. The second season ended up being some of the most pointed and on the mark social commentary that I've seen while also being an entertaining thing unto itself, which is a really that's a hard needle to thread, I think. And I was particularly impressed with what they did for that. And I find myself kind of coming back to that. If I were going to recommend something that I've been watching and really liking recently, it would be The Boys on Amazon Prime.
No, that's a fantastic champion. We've gotten a few folks right in hyping. I mean, no surprise. I mean, hyping it up.
Yeah. Even other host members talking about how awesome
absolutely.
That show is.
Obviously, I am well behind the curve, but your cosign means I'm going to go ahead and bump it up in my queue. I think you have one last question for Justin before we let him do his shameless plugs.
Yeah.
I'll turn it over to you, brother.
Yeah. So this is something that we had asked a few guests in the past, and it's an interesting little exercise, essentially. What, in your opinion, is or are comics? How would you define it?
I think comics is the art of telling a story through sequential images. And in a static manner. I think that is kind of what makes comic. I am sort of agnostic about the form that takes. It's one of those things where if you were doing fumetti or if you were doing web comics or you're doing, even comic strips, I to me, those are all comics. It is all the art of juxtaposing story and text in a way that is telling a story in a series of images. And anything that kind of does that, I am perfectly willing to consider comics. I'm not a purist who thinks that comics need to be, single issues or graphic novels or that kind of stuff. And, that can be pretty expansive. I've seen some really still cool stuff like Jason. I want to say Shiga is his last name. Who's done some really cool comics that you can navigate in an infinite number of ways. Almost, he did one called Demon that's really cool. And that stuff is still comics. You know what I mean? It's not anything you could do on a page, and it is not anything that Will Eisner did, but it is still essentially comics.
Dang.
He wasn't afraid to jump on that.
Well said.
Just in this whole interview, you have not been afraid to answer our questions. You've made us laugh. You made us think. We are excited for Urban Animal based on what we've read so far. I'm glad that the Kickstarter has well surpassed its goal with a lot of days left. And with all that being said, I want to go ahead and allow you to once again let people know where they can find Urban Animal, how they can support it, get a copy of Volume 1, as well as how they can reach out and stay up to date with what you're working on.
Talk to the people.
Yeah, so Urban Animal, I think probably the easiest way to remember is urbananimalcomic.com, which will redirect you to the Kickstarter right now. Also, just Googling Urban Animal Kickstarter, I think will almost certainly get you there. If you want to follow along with me generally, Justin Jordan Comics on Facebook and Justin Jordan Comics on Instagram are both me, where I post up a fair bit of samples, little chunks, panels, and that sort of thing from my comics. And then whenever I have the inclination to ramble, you can find me there. I'm Justin_Jordan at Twitter. I do much less on there. I'm not a Twitter guy. But yeah, if they want to check out the Kickstarter, I think we've got a really cool book for a really good price, and we're funded and the art's done, so we're not going to fuck you.
Also isolating that, and I think that's a wrap, guys.
No one has ever. That was really good.
That's the best.
He said, and we won't fuck you.
That's the best plug I've heard on the show. Period.
Man, Justin, you have been a pleasure to chat with. Everything Amber has said about you, you've lived up to.
Yeah, man.
I want to say thank you for so much for hopping on, talking about Urban Animal. Congrats on the success. Thank you for the comic books that you've put into my life as well as Cesar's.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think you're an awesome ambassador for the medium of comics, man.
Yeah.
And
well, thank you. And thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate it. And please do tell Amber thank you for recommending me to you guys. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Not a problem, bud. And honestly, I've been pushing your shit to people at work, which is pretty funny because I get very aggressive about it. I'm like, yo, you need to get on this Urban Animal, man. What's the matter with your life right now? And they're like, oh my God.
What I've always wanted to do is get a t-shirt cannon and just fire rolled up comics of mine at
point blank.
Yeah.
It's not even Urban Animal shirts. It's just the most random shirts too at some point.
He's like, Koosh, take that. We're not going to fuck you.
Yeah. That's what the shirt should say.
Perfect branding.
All right.
Clearly.
Anyways, Justin, thank you so much. I am confident our Shortbox Nation enjoyed this conversation. I want to go ahead and just reiterate to our fans and listeners, check out Urban Animal, support Justin Jordan, read his comic books.
Do it.
And until next time, Jordan, thank you so much. We'll keep in touch soon, right?
Thanks, guys.
You got it.
And that's the end of our show, Shortbox Nation. Hopefully you're already making plans to check out Urban Animal on Webtoons and backing the Kickstarter. Thank you for hanging out and sharing your time. You could be listening to any other podcast, but you're here with us, and that means a lot. I personally want to recognize and thank the people who made this episode possible. Our sponsor, Gotham City Limit, our guest of honor, Justin Jordan, and our Shortbox patrons. Like I mentioned in the intro, if you feel inclined to help us pay some podcast bills and keep this thing going, consider becoming a Shortbox patron. We'll reward you with bonus episodes, commercial-free listening, merch, and more. Visit patreon.com/theshortbox to find out more. With all that being said, listeners, stay safe, stay healthy, take care of yourselves, take care of each other. Next week's episode will be Cesar's choice for the next comic spotlight, which happens to be The Batman Adventures Mad Love, written by Paul Dini and Bruce Timm. So make sure you're subscribed to the podcast feed and stay tuned. In the meantime, continue to make mine and yours Shortbox. And keep it geeky.